The knight Hakon Wulfridge paid $300 silver for a Cherokee woman's body. He had no idea he was buying a war that would cost him blood, burn his land to ash, and force him to break every oath he ever swore to keep. But when she looked him dead in the eye and whispered those 5 words that would haunt him forever, he knew there was no turning back. The wind screamed across the Dakota Badlands like a wounded animal, carrying with it the stench of whiskey, gunpowder, and desperation. Hakon Wulfridge rode into the trading post settlement of Bitter Creek just as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the cracked earth the color of old blood. His horse, a massive black stallion named Obsidian, snorted steam into the frozen air, its flanks slick with sweat from 3 days of hard riding. Hakon was a man carved from silence and stone. Half Cherokee, half white, he belonged nowhere and everywhere, a ghost drifting through territories that wanted nothing to do with men like him. His father had been a fur trapper from Virginia, his mother a healer from the Bird Clan. Both were dead now, buried under earth that didn't care about bloodlines. He'd spent the last 5 years alone, hunting bounties, trading pelts, and avoiding anything that resembled attachment. But tonight, something pulled him off the trail. Maybe it was the smoke rising from the settlement, thicker than usual. Maybe it was the sound of men shouting, the kind of shouting that always preceded violence. Or maybe it was something deeper, something in his bones that told him if he rode past this place, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. He dismounted near the edge of the settlement, tying Obsidian to a post outside a crumbling saloon. The voices inside were loud, slurred, drunk on cheap liquor and cheaper morals. Hakon pushed through the door, and the room went quiet for exactly 3 seconds before the noise resumed. Men deciding he wasn't worth their attention. The saloon was packed with traders, drifters, soldiers, and outlaws, all crowded around a makeshift stage at the far end of the room. On that stage stood a man Hakon recognized immediately, Garrett Sloane, a flesh peddler who trafficked in human misery. Sloane was grinning, his yellow teeth flashing in the lamplight as he addressed the crowd like a carnival barker. And beside him, chained by the wrists to a wooden post, stood a woman. She was Cherokee, no mistaking it. Her skin was bronze, even in the dim light, her black hair tangled and wild, falling past her shoulders like a curtain of night. She wore a torn buckskin dress that had seen better days, the fringe stained with dirt and blood. But it wasn't her appearance that made Hakon freeze in the doorway. It was her eyes. Dark, burning, defiant eyes that held no fear, only rage, a quiet, simmering fury that promised violence to anyone who came too close. Sloane's voice cut through the noise like a rusty blade. "Gentlemen, I present to you a rare prize, a full-blooded Cherokee woman, young, strong, and wild as a Mustang. She's got fight in her, which some of you might like, and she's got skills, cooking, sewing, tracking, all the things a man needs on the frontier. Starting bid is $100 silver. The room erupted in shouts, men waving coins and bills, their faces twisted with greed and lust. Hakon felt his stomach turn. He'd seen this before, seen women sold like cattle, but something about this one was different. She wasn't cowering, she wasn't weeping. She stood there like a queen facing execution, her chin high, her gaze cutting through the crowd with cold precision. "200!" someone shouted from the back. "250!" another voice called. Belonging to a soldier with sergeant's stripes, Sloane grinned wider. "That's the spirit. Do I hear 300? "The 300, Hakon said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The room went silent. Every head turned toward him. Sloane's grin faltered before returning. Well, looks like we've got a serious buyer. 300 from the Cherokee rider. Anyone want to top that?" The soldier started to raise his hand, but the woman on the stage turned her gaze directly on Hakon, and for a moment, the entire world narrowed to just the two of them. Her eyes burned into his, searching, questioning, and then something shifted in her expression. "Sold," Sloane declared, slamming his hand on the post. 300 to the gentleman in the back. "Come collect your property, friend." Hakon moved through the crowd, each step feeling heavier than the last. Men clapped him on the back, made crude jokes, offered advice he didn't want. He ignored them all, his focus locked on the woman as Sloane unlocked her chains. The moment the iron fell away, she rubbed her wrists, red and raw from the metal. "Congratulations," Sloane said, shoving a key into Hakan's hand. "She's all yours. Fair warning, though, she's a biter. Tried to take a chunk out of my hand yesterday." Hakan didn't respond. He looked at the woman and reached out slowly, offering his hand to help her down from the stage. She slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice low and sharp as broken glass. Hakan pulled his hand back, nodding once. "Wasn't planning to." They walked out of the saloon together, but not side by side. She stayed 3 paces behind him, her bare feet silent on the frozen ground, her eyes never leaving his back. Hakan could feel her gaze like a blade between his shoulder blades. When they reached Obsidian, Hakan untied the reins and turned to face her. "Can you ride?" She didn't answer, just stared at him with those burning eyes. "There's a cabin about 10 miles north," he continued. "You can stay there tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." "What comes next?" She repeated, her tone mocking. "You paid $300 for me. Don't pretend you don't know what comes next." Hakan met her gaze without flinching. "I know what they expect, but that's not why I bought you." "Then why?" she demanded, stepping closer. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think saving me makes you better than them?" No, Hakan said quietly. "I think leaving you there would have made me worse." For a long moment she said nothing. The wind howled around them, kicking up dust and snow. Finally she spoke, her voice softer but no less dangerous. "My name is Liluya Rainwalker. I was taken from my home 3 months ago by soldiers who burned my village and killed my family. Sloane bought me from them for $50 and has been selling me town to town ever since." "You're the 7th man to buy me." Hakan felt something cold settle in his chest. "What happened to the other 6? Liluya's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "They tried to touch me. I made sure they regretted it." She pulled aside the torn fabric of her dress, revealing a jagged scar running from her collarbone to her ribs. "This is what the 4th one gave me when I fought back. I gave him worse. The 5th one tried to chain me to a bed. I waited until he fell asleep and drove a kitchen knife through his hand. The 6th one thought he could break me with his fists." "Where is he now?" Hakan asked. "Buried in a shallow grave outside Fort Laramie," Liluya said flatly. Sloane covered it up, said it was an accident. "Then he dragged me here to sell me again." Hakan processed this, his jaw tight. "I'm not like them." "That's what they all said," Liluya shot back. "And you know what? I don't care if you're different. You paid for my body. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take me to your cabin. You're going to do whatever it is you think you paid for. And when you're done, when you finally fall asleep thinking you've won, I'm going to slit your throat and take your horse." The words hung in the frozen air between them, sharp and final. Hakan should have been angry. He should have thrown her back and demanded his money. But instead he felt something else entirely, respect maybe, or recognition. This woman wasn't broken. She was a blade sharpened by suffering, and she was offering him a choice: be the man she expected him to be and die, or prove her wrong. "Fair enough," Hakan said, swinging himself onto Obsidian. He reached down, offering his hand again. "But you'll have to get on the horse first." Liluya stared at his hand for a long moment. Then, against every instinct screaming at her, she took it. His grip was firm but not crushing, and he pulled her up behind him with surprising gentleness. She settled onto the horse, her body rigid, refusing to lean into him even as the cold wind cut through her thin dress. They rode north into the darkness. The only sound, the rhythmic thunder of Obsidian's hooves and the howling wind. Liluya kept one hand on the knife she'd hidden in her boot, the blade she'd taken from the last man who'd tried to claim her. She would wait. She would watch. And when the moment came, she would not hesitate. The ride stretched on through the frozen night, each mile marked by the crunch of hooves on ice-crusted ground. The temperature dropped further as they left Bitter Creek behind, the stars emerging sharp and cold overhead like shards of broken glass. Liluya's teeth chattered despite her attempts to control it. her torn dress offering almost no protection against the December wind that cut through fabric and skin alike. Hakon felt her shivering behind him but said nothing. Any offer of warmth would be rejected, any gesture of kindness interpreted as weakness or manipulation. So he simply guided Obsidian with steady hands, following a trail only he could see in the darkness, letting the horse pick its way across terrain that would have broken a lesser animal's legs. After what felt like hours, structures emerged from the darkness. Not a town, just a cabin and a small barn, isolated and alone in a valley between two rocky ridges. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, and the windows were dark. This was clearly a place where a man lived alone, where company was neither expected nor desired. Hakon dismounted first, then offered his hand to help Liluya down. This time, she ignored it completely, sliding off the horse herself and nearly collapsing when her numb feet hit the ground. Pride kept her upright, that and the knowledge that showing weakness now might be fatal. "Barn's that way," Hakon said, nodding toward the smaller structure. "I'll get Obsidian settled. Door's unlocked. Get inside before you freeze." Liluya didn't move. "You're not coming?" "Horse needs tending first," Hakon replied, already leading Obsidian toward the barn. "Fire starters on the mantel, wood stacked by the hearth. Make yourself useful." He disappeared into the darkness, leaving her standing alone in front of the cabin. For a brief moment, Liluya considered running. She could steal supplies, disappear into the night, take her chances with the wilderness rather than whatever waited inside that cabin. But her feet were bleeding. Her body was shaking with cold. And somewhere in the rational part of her mind, she knew she wouldn't survive 3 miles in this weather. She pushed open the cabin door. The interior was sparse but clean. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a bed in the corner covered with furs and wool blankets. The walls were hung with traps, snowshoes, and a rifle that looked well-maintained. This was a hunter's cabin, a trapper's home, not the lair of a monster. Liluya found the fire starter where Hakon said it would be, a small tin box containing char cloth, flint, and steel. Her hands shook as she worked, partly from cold, partly from exhaustion, but she got the kindling lit. Within minutes, flames were crackling in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. She stood by the fire, letting the heat seep into her frozen body, and for the first time in 3 months felt something other than terror or rage. She felt, if not safe, then at least temporarily out of immediate danger. It was a feeling so unfamiliar that it almost hurt. The door opened and Hakon entered, carrying his saddlebags and rifle. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd lived alone for years, hanging his gear on pegs, checking his weapons, going through rituals worn smooth by repetition. He barely glanced at Liluya as he moved around the cabin. "There's jerky and hardtack in the tin on the shelf," he said, his voice neutral. "Coffee in the pot if you want to heat water. Blankets on the bed are clean. Where will you sleep?" Liluya asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Hakon pulled a bedroll from beneath the bed and tossed it on the floor near the fireplace. "Here, you take the bed. I don't need charity." "Wasn't offering charity," Hakon replied, sitting down at the table and pulling off his boots. "You take the bed because if you're planning to kill me in my sleep, I'd rather see you coming. Floor gives me a clear view of the whole room." The bluntness of his words caught her off guard. Most men would have pretended not to hear her threat, would have tried to convince her they were trustworthy. Hakon simply acknowledged the danger and adapted to it. Liluya moved to the shelf, found the tin of jerky, and ate, standing up, never taking her eyes off him. The meat was tough and salty, but it was food, the first real food she'd had in 2 days. She forced herself to eat slowly, to not betray how desperately hungry she was. Hakon made coffee, the smell rich and bitter in the small cabin. He poured 2 cups without asking, set one on the table for himself, and left the other on the shelf near Liluya. Then he sat, drank his coffee, and stared into the fire. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded with unspoken questions. Finally Liluya spoke. "Why did you really buy me?" Hakon was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My mother was Cherokee, Bird Clan. She married a white trapper, and both their people turned their backs on them. I watched her die slowly, ground down by a world that hated her for loving the wrong man. When I saw you on that stage, I saw her. Saw what she might have become if my father had been a different kind of man. So I'm what? Your chance at redemption? Liluya's voice dripped with scorn. You save the Cherokee woman, and your guilt goes away. No, Hakan said flatly. My guilt doesn't go anywhere. Nothing I do will bring her back or undo what she suffered. I bought you because leaving you there would have been one more thing I'd have to carry. I've got enough weight already. Liluya studied him in the firelight, trying to find the lie in his words, the crack in his armor that would reveal his true intentions. But his face was unreadable, worn smooth by hardship and solitude. You know I'll kill you if you touch me, she said, her voice low and certain. I know. You know I've killed before, that it doesn't bother me anymore. I know that too. Then why risk it? Why not just do what you paid for and be done with it? Why pretend this is anything other than what it is? Hakan finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Because maybe I'm tired of the world being exactly what we expect it to be. Maybe I'm tired of watching people become the monsters circumstances make them. Maybe for once I'd like to see if something different is possible. It's not, Liluya said bitterly. Different isn't possible. Not for people like us. Maybe not, Hakan agreed. But we won't know unless we try. He stood, moved to his bedroll, and lay down with his back to her, his hand resting near the knife at his belt. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, or at least a convincing imitation of it. Liluya stood frozen by the fire, her hand on the knife in her boot, her mind racing. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. He was asleep, vulnerable, and she had a blade. She could end this now, could take his horse and supplies and disappear into the territories where white law couldn't follow. But something held her back. Not trust, definitely not trust, but perhaps curiosity, or maybe just exhaustion so complete that even murder felt like too much effort. She moved to the bed, every muscle tense, and sat on the edge of it fully clothed, the knife still in her hand. She told herself she was just resting for a moment, gathering her strength before she struck. She told herself she was waiting for him to fall into deeper sleep. She told herself she was still in control, still the predator and not the prey. But as the fire burned lower and the warmth finally reached her frozen bones, her eyes grew heavy, despite her best efforts. The bed was soft, softer than anything she'd felt in months, and her body betrayed her, pulling her down into sleep even as her mind screamed at her to stay alert. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Hakan's silhouette by the fire, still and silent as the grave. Dawn broke cold and grey over the Dakota Badlands. The sun hidden behind clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Liluya woke with a gasp, her hand immediately reaching for the knife that had slipped from her fingers during the night. Panic flooded her chest as she realized she'd fallen asleep, that she'd let her guard down in the presence of a man who'd bought her body for $300 silver. But the cabin was empty except for her. The bedroll by the fire was neatly rolled and tied. Hakan's rifle was gone from its peg, and fresh wood had been added to the hearth while she slept. On the table sat a plate with more jerky, some dried apples, and a cup of coffee that was still warm enough to steam in the cold air. Liluya sat up slowly, every muscle in her body screaming protest. The warmth of the bed and the first real rest she'd had in weeks had allowed her body to finally acknowledge its injuries. Her ribs ached where the sixth man had kicked her. Her wrists were raw and swollen from the chains, and her feet were a mess of cuts and blisters from walking barefoot across frozen ground. She moved to the window, staying to the side where she couldn't be easily seen from outside, and peered out. Hakan was in the corral next to the barn, working with obsidian. The big stallion was saddled, but Hakan wasn't mounting. Instead, he was checking the animal's hooves one by one, speaking to the horse in a low voice she couldn't hear. It was the kind of gentle, patient work that didn't match with the violence she'd been expecting. The coffee called to her. Liluya approached the table like it might be a trap, studying the cup and plate for any sign of tampering. But it was just coffee and food, simple and plain. She drank the coffee first, holding the warm cup in both hands, feeling the heat seep into her palms. Then she ate the jerky and apples, forcing herself to eat slowly, even though her stomach demanded she devour everything in sight. The cabin door opened, and Hakan entered, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He glanced at the empty plate and nodded once, satisfied, then moved to the shelves and began pulling down supplies. Storm's coming," he said without preamble. "Big one by the look of those clouds. We'll be stuck here for at least 3 days once it hits." Liluya said, her voice sharp. "I'm not staying here for 3 days. You planning to walk out into a Dakota blizzard in a torn dress with no shoes?" Hakan asked, his tone reasonable. "Because that's suicide, and if you wanted to die, you could have done it easier back in Bitter Creek. Maybe I'll take your horse." "Obsidian won't let you ride him," Hakan said flatly. "He barely tolerates me most days. You try to mount him without me there, and he'll throw you so hard you'll break bones." Lilui's jaw clenched. She hated that he was right, hated that she was trapped here by circumstance and weather and her own battered body. "So what, I'm your prisoner now instead of Sloane's?" "You're not a prisoner," Hakan said, turning to look at her directly. "Door's not locked. You want to leave, leave. But if you stay, there are rules." "Rules," Lilui repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "First rule, you don't try to kill me unless I give you actual cause," Hakan said, holding up one finger. "Buying you doesn't count as cause, not when I'm offering you freedom after the storm passes. Second rule, you pull your weight. I'm not your servant, and this isn't a hotel. You eat my food, you help with the work. Third rule, you stay out of my way when I'm working, and I'll stay out of yours. And if I break your rules," Liluya challenged, "then I'll put you on Obsidian myself and point you toward the nearest town, storm or no storm," Hakan said simply. "I'm offering you shelter and safety, not a fight. Whether you take it or not is your choice." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "There's women's clothes in the trunk at the foot of the bed. They were my mother's. Probably fit you better than that torn dress. Use them if you want." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Lilui stood in the empty cabin, her mind churning with confusion and suspicion. Every man she'd encountered in the past 3 months had wanted something from her, had tried to take something from her. But Hakan's behavior made no sense. He'd spent $300 to buy her, then gave her a bed while he slept on the floor. He'd left her alone with weapons in the cabin, left the door unlocked, offered her his dead mother's clothes. It had to be a trick. Some elaborate game designed to make her lower her guard so he could strike when she least expected it. That was the only explanation that made sense. But even as she thought it, doubt crept in. What kind of game involved giving your captive multiple opportunities to kill you in your sleep? What kind of trick required sleeping on a hard floor when you owned the only bed? Lilui moved to the trunk, her curiosity overcoming her caution. Inside, she found dresses, carefully folded and preserved, made from a mix of Cherokee and white styles. There were buckskin skirts with trade cloth blouses, cotton dresses with beadwork collars, even a fine wool coat lined with rabbit fur. All of it had been packed away with cedar chips to keep the moths out. Preserved like sacred relics, she pulled out a dress that looked close to her size, a simple design of dark blue trade cloth with red and white beadwork at the collar and cuffs. Cherokee patterns made by Cherokee hands. She held it up to her chest and caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging by the door. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her hair was a tangled mess, her face was gaunt and bruised, her eyes were hollow with exhaustion and pain. She looked like something that had crawled out of a grave, like a ghost wearing human skin. Lilui dropped the dress and backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in short gasps. When had she become this? When had the strong Cherokee woman who'd buried her family and sworn to survive turned into this broken, terrified creature? No, not broken, not yet. She straightened her spine, forced her breathing to steady, and picked up the dress again. If she was going to survive, she needed to be practical. The torn buckskin dress she wore now was useless against the cold, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She would wear the dead woman's clothes because it made tactical sense, not because Hakan had offered them. She changed quickly, listening for footsteps outside the door. The dress fit reasonably well, a bit loose in places where hunger had stolen her flesh, but warm and whole. There were also leggings, moccasins lined with fur, and a shawl woven with traditional patterns. She dressed in layers, preparing for the storm Hakan had predicted. When she emerged from the cabin, Hakan was splitting wood near the barn, his axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. He'd removed his coat despite the cold, working in just his shirt, steam rising from his shoulders with each swing. The woodpile beside him was already substantial, but he kept working, building up reserves for the coming storm. Liluye watched him for a moment, studying the economical efficiency of his movements, the way he worked with purpose but without hurry. Then she moved toward him, her new moccasins silent on the frozen ground. Hakan paused mid-swing when he noticed her, his eyes taking in the dress, the shawl, the fact that she looked more like a person and less like a victim. He nodded once, then returned to his work without comment. "You said I had to pull my weight," Liluye said, her voice challenging. "So give me work." Hakan drove the axe into the chopping block and turned to face her. "Can you shoot? Can you skin and dress game?" "I'm Cherokee," Liluye said, as if that answered everything, and it did. Hakan gestured toward the barn. "Then come with me. We need fresh meat before the storm hits, and I'd rather not leave you here alone with all my possessions." "Don't trust me?" Liluye asked, a hint of dark amusement in her voice. "Would you trust you?" Hakan replied. They saddled Obsidian together, working in tense silence. Hakan showed her how to approach the stallion, where to touch and where to avoid, reading the horse's body language like a language he'd spoken since birth. Obsidian tolerated Liluye's presence, but made it clear through pinned ears and sidelong looks that acceptance was not the same as welcome. Hakan mounted first, then pulled Liluye up behind him. This time, she allowed herself to hold onto his belt for stability, though she made sure the knife in her boot was still accessible. They rode out of the valley and up into the rocky ridges where pine trees clung to steep slopes and game trails wound through the underbrush. The hunting was good. Within an hour, they'd spotted a small herd of mule deer moving through a stand of pines. Hakan dismounted silently, pulling his rifle from its scabbard, and gestured for Liluye to stay with the horse. But she shook her head and followed him, moving through the brush with a silence that surprised him. She'd been raised in these skills, had learned to hunt before she'd learned to read, and muscle memory took over where conscious thought failed. They moved together without speaking, communicating through hand signals and shared understanding of the land. Hakan took the shot, a clean kill that dropped a young buck instantly, and Liluye was already moving forward with his hunting knife before the echo faded. They field dressed the deer together, their hands working in practiced rhythm, blood steaming in the cold air. Hakan watched her work and saw the competence he'd suspected, the skill that came from a lifetime of living close to the land. This woman wasn't helpless, wasn't some delicate flower to be protected. She was a survivor, practical and capable, and he found himself respecting that more than any fragile beauty. "You're good at this," he said as they worked. "My father taught me," Liluye replied, her voice distant. "He said a Cherokee woman should be able to feed her family even if all the men were killed in war." He was right. As it turns out, Hakan heard the pain beneath the words, but didn't push. They finished the work in silence, loading the deer onto Obsidian's back, and started the ride back to the cabin. The first snowflakes began to fall as they entered the valley, fat and heavy, the kind that promised accumulation. By the time they'd unloaded the deer and gotten it hanging in the cold room attached to the barn, the snow was falling thick enough to obscure the far ridge. They worked together to prepare for the storm, bringing in extra wood, checking that the barn was secure, filling water barrels before the creek froze solid. It was hard, physical work that left no room for awkwardness or tension, just two people preparing to survive what nature was about to throw at them. As darkness fell and the storm intensified, they retreated to the cabin. Snow was already piling against the door, and the wind howled like something alive and hungry. Hakan built up the fire, while Liluye prepared a meal from the fresh venison, her hands moving with practiced skill as she cut meat and set it to cook in the iron skillet. They ate at the table, the first real meal either of them had shared with another person in longer than either wanted to admit. The venison was good, seasoned with wild herbs Liluye had found in Hakan's supplies. And they ate in silence, broken only by the storm raging outside. After the meal, Liluye cleaned the dishes, while Hakan checked his weapons and tools, both of them moving around the small cabin in a careful dance of avoiding each other. Finally, as the fire burned low, Hakan spoke. "Tomorrow I'll teach you the land around here, where the water sources are, where game tends to shelter, which direction leads to the nearest town. Information you'll need if you decide to leave when the storm breaks." Liluye turned from the wash basin, studying him in the firelight. "Why would you tell me that? Why would you make it easier for me to leave?" "Because keeping you here against your will makes me no different than Sloane," Hakan said simply. "You deserve the choice to stay or go, and choice means nothing without information." "You really mean that?" Liluye said. And it wasn't quite a question. "I really mean that. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." She turned back to the dishes, her mind churning with thoughts she couldn't quite name. This man who'd bought her body was offering her freedom. This stranger who had every legal right to claim her was sleeping on the floor and teaching her how to survive without him. It didn't make sense. Didn't fit with anything she'd learned about men in the past 3 months. That night, as Hakan settled into his bedroll by the fire and Liluye lay in the bed with her knife under the pillow, something had shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something that might eventually grow into trust if given enough time and space. Outside, the storm buried the world in white, erasing all the trails that had led them here, leaving them isolated and alone together in a cabin that was slowly beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a refuge. The storm lasted 4 days instead of 3, turning the world outside the cabin into a howling white void, where sky and earth merged into one endless wall of snow. By the second day, drifts had climbed halfway up the cabin walls, and the door had to be forced open with Hakan's shoulder to create a path to the barn, where obsidian waited out the blizzard in restless isolation. Liluye had never been trapped in such close quarters with a man she didn't trust, and the proximity wore on her nerves like a blade being slowly sharpened. Every movement Hakan made, every time he stood or walked across the room, her hand would drift toward the knife she now kept tucked in her belt. But as the hours stretched into days, she began to notice things that confused her carefully maintained hatred. Hakan never watched her when she changed clothes behind the privacy curtain she'd rigged in the corner. He always turned his back, always made noise so she'd know where he was, always gave her space, even in the confined cabin. When they ate, he served her first, taking the smaller portion for himself without comment. When she woke, gasping from nightmares that replayed her village burning, he would add wood to the fire and make tea, setting it on the table without asking what she'd dreamed, respecting her silence. On the 3rd day, cabin fever drove them to conversation. Liluye was mending a tear in one of the dresses, her stitches neat and practiced, when Hakan spoke from where he sat cleaning his rifle. "How did they catch you?" he asked quietly. "You're too skilled to have been taken easily." Liluye's hands stilled on the fabric. Every instinct told her to refuse to answer, to keep her pain locked away where it couldn't be used against her. But something about the endless storm, about the isolation, about the strange safety of this cabin loosened her tongue. "They came at dawn," she said, her voice flat and distant. 3 dozen soldiers, led by a captain who'd been given orders to clear Cherokee settlements from the disputed territories. We weren't even on disputed land, but maps mean nothing to men with guns and quotas to fill. They surrounded the village while most people were still sleeping. She set down her sewing, staring into the fire, as if seeing that morning replayed in the flames. My father was the first to die. He stepped out of our home to see what the commotion was, and they shot him where he stood, no warning, no chance to speak. My mother ran to him, and they let her reach his body before they threw torches on our house. I tried to run to her, but 2 soldiers grabbed me, held me down in the dirt, made me watch as the flames took her. Hakan's hands had stopped moving on his rifle, his attention completely focused on her words. My brother Lakota was 16, Lilui continued, her voice cracking slightly. He grabbed a hunting knife and tried to fight. He killed 1 soldier before they beat him down. They could have just restrained him, could have tied him up, but the captain was angry about losing a man. He made an example. They beat Lakota until his face was unrecognizable, then shot him in front of everyone as a warning. How did you survive? Hakan asked softly. The captain decided dead Cherokee women weren't as useful as live ones, Lilui said bitterly. He had plans to sell the younger women to offset the cost of the expedition. There were 5 of us initially, girls and young women they deemed pretty enough or young enough to fetch a price. They tied us together and marched us 3 days to Fort Laramie. She picked up her sewing again, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady. 1 girl tried to escape the first night. They caught her within an hour and beat her so badly she couldn't walk. They left her by the side of the trail with a canteen of water and rode on. Another girl died of fever on the 2nd day. They just cut her loose from the rope and kept moving. By the time we reached the fort, there were only 3 of us left. What happened to the others? Hakan asked. Sold to different buyers, Lilui said. I don't know where they are now or if they're even alive. Sloan bought me because I fought back. He said spirited women fetched higher prices from certain types of men. Men who liked breaking things. The cabin fell silent except for the howl of wind and the crackle of fire. Hakan set aside his rifle and moved to the stove, preparing more tea with hands that were completely steady, despite the rage Lilui could see burning in his eyes. The captain's name, Hakan said as he worked. Do you remember it? No, Captain Marcus Hendricks, Lilui replied immediately. I'll remember that name until the day I die. Hakan poured 2 cups of tea and brought one to her. Hendricks, he repeated, committing it to memory. If our paths cross, he'll answer for what he did. Why do you care? Lilui asked, accepting the tea but watching him with suspicious eyes. My people aren't your people. You're only half Cherokee, you said so yourself. You live out here alone, no ties to any tribe or town. Why would you risk yourself for revenge that isn't even yours? Hakan settled back in his chair, cradling his own cup. My mother used to tell me that blood calls to blood, that being half Cherokee didn't make me half a person. She said I had a responsibility to both halves of myself, to honor both the Cherokee who raised her and the white man who loved her. I failed her when she was alive, too busy trying to belong nowhere so I couldn't be rejected anywhere. But maybe I don't have to keep failing, so I'm your redemption project. Lilui said, her voice sharp again. No, Hakan replied firmly. You're a woman who survived hell and came out fighting. I'm just a man trying to do one decent thing in a world that doesn't have nearly enough of them. Lilui studied him over the rim of her cup, seeing something in his face she hadn't allowed herself to see before. Sincerity, maybe, or at least the absence of the calculated cruelty she'd learned to recognize in men's eyes. It terrified her more than any threat could have. The 4th day brought a break in the storm. The wind died to whispers, and weak sunlight filtered through clouds that were finally moving east. Hakan forced the door open to reveal a world transformed. Everything buried under 4 feet of pristine white snow that glittered like crushed diamonds in the pale light. We need to dig out the barn, Hakan said, pulling on his heavy coat. Obsidian's been cooped up too long. He'll be mean as a snake by now. They worked together in the brutal cold, shoveling paths between buildings, breaking ice on the water barrels, checking that the stored meat hadn't been reached by hungry predators. It was exhausting work, made harder by the thin air and bitter temperature, but it felt good to move, to do something physical after days of enforced stillness. Obsidian was indeed mean, ears pinned flat and teeth bared as Hakan entered the barn. But Hakan spoke to the horse in Cherokee, words Liluye hadn't heard in months, the language of her childhood rising from this half-breed stranger's throat with perfect pronunciation and gentle cadence. The stallion gradually calmed, allowing himself to be led out into the corral where he could stretch and move. "You speak the language well," Liluye observed, watching horse and man together. "My mother insisted," Hakan replied, running his hands over Obsidian's legs to check for any problems from the confinement. "She said if I lost the language, I'd lose the last real connection to her people. She was right, as mothers usually are." Liluye felt something crack in her chest, some piece of the armor she'd been wearing since her family died. This man who lived alone, who belonged nowhere, who'd spent $300 to buy her freedom rather than her body, he understood loss in a way she recognized. He'd been hollowed out by grief and absence, just as she had been. "Teach me to ride him," she said suddenly, surprising herself. Hakan looked up, his dark eyes questioning. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to leave when the trail's clear, I need to know how to handle a horse like this," Liluye said, the lie coming easily. "And if I'm going to stay, I need to be useful for more than cooking and sewing." The word "stay" hung in the cold air between them, unplanned and dangerous. Hakan heard it. She could see recognition flash across his face, but he had the wisdom not to comment on it directly. "He's not an easy horse," Hakan warned. "He's been mine for 3 years, and he still tests me daily." "Then I'll be tested too," Liluye replied stubbornly. So began an education in horse and man both. Hakan taught her how to approach Obsidian, how to read the subtle signals in the angle of his ears and the tension in his muscles. He showed her how to saddle the stallion without getting bitten or kicked, where to place her hands, how to mount from the left side in one smooth motion that didn't spook the animal. Liluye learned quickly, her natural affinity for animals combining with determination born from necessity. Obsidian fought her at first, testing this new human who smelled of fear and anger and other things he didn't understand. But Liluye didn't back down, didn't show weakness, even when the stallion deliberately stepped on her foot or swung his massive head around trying to intimidate her. "He respects strength," Hakan explained, watching from a safe distance. "But he responds to gentleness. You have to show him you're not afraid, while also showing him you're not a threat. It's a balance, like everything else in this cursed world," Liluye muttered, but she adjusted her approach. By the end of that day, she'd managed to ride Obsidian around the corral twice without being thrown. It wasn't trust between horse and rider, not yet, but it was a beginning. When she dismounted, legs shaking from the effort of staying on an animal that didn't want her there. Hakan nodded approval. "You'll do," he said simply. And somehow those 2 words meant more than any flowery praise could have. That evening, they prepared the venison for long-term storage, cutting it into strips for jerking, rendering fat for tallow, using every part of the animal because waste was a sin against both Cherokee and frontier values. They worked side by side at the table, their hands moving in practiced rhythm, occasionally reaching for the same tool or piece of meat, learning the dance of shared labor. "Why did you really buy me?" Liluye asked as they worked, the question that had haunted her since Bitter Creek finally given voice. Hakan was quiet for a long moment, his knife never pausing in its work. "I told you I saw my mother in you." "That's not the whole truth," Liluye pressed. "There's something else, something you're not saying." Hakan set down his knife and looked at her directly, his eyes dark and serious in the lamplight. 5 years ago, I watched a woman get sold at a trading post outside Cheyenne. She was Lakota, young, terrified. Man who bought her was a trapper I knew, mean drunk who beat his dogs for entertainment. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I couldn't save everyone, that interfering would just cause trouble I didn't need." He picked up his knife again, But his hands were no longer steady. Found her body 3 months later when I was running a trapline. He'd worked her to death, then left her corpse in a ravine for the scavengers. She couldn't have been more than 16. I buried her as best I could, and I swore that if I ever had another chance, I wouldn't walk away. When I saw you on that stage, I saw her. Saw the choice I didn't make before. So I made a different choice. Lilui felt tears burning in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. So I'm a redemption project? No, Hakan said firmly. That girl's death isn't on you, and saving you doesn't erase my failure with her. You're not a symbol or a second chance. You're just a woman who deserved better than what this world gave you. Same as my mother, same as that Lakota girl, same as 1,000 other women, ground up by men who think cruelty is strength. And you think kindness is strength. Liluya challenged. I think kindness takes more courage than cruelty, Hakan replied. Any coward can hurt someone weaker. It takes strength to be gentle in a world that punishes gentleness. Liluya wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the wall she'd built around her heart, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she returned to her work, cutting meat in silence while her mind churned with thoughts she couldn't quite name. That night, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Liluya didn't sleep with her knife under the pillow. She told herself it was because the blade was uncomfortable, that it disturbed her rest, that it was a purely practical decision. But as she drifted towards sleep, listening to Hakan's steady breathing from his bedroll by the fire, she knew the truth. She was beginning to trust him, and that realization terrified her more than any violence ever could. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Hakan announced they would ride out to check the trap lines he'd set before the storm, and perhaps hunt for additional meat while the weather held. Liluya prepared quickly, dressing in layers against the cold, checking that her knife was secure in her boot, even though she wasn't quite sure anymore who she thought she might need to use it against. They rode Obsidian together, Liluya seated behind Hakan, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability as they navigated through snow that came up to the horse's chest in places. The world was silent, except for the crunch of hooves through snow and the occasional call of a raven overhead. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, this frozen landscape that killed careless travelers but sheltered those who understood its rules. At the first trapline, they found a fox caught cleanly by the leg. Hakan dispatched it quickly and humanely, then showed Liluya how to reset the trap and disguise it properly. At the second line, they found nothing but tracks showing where a coyote had stolen the bait without triggering the mechanism. Smart, Hakan commented, studying the tracks. Coyotes learn fast. This one's probably raided several traps by now. My brother could trap coyotes, Liluya said quietly. He had a gift for it, could think like they thought. My father used to say Dakota had coyote medicine, that the trickster spirit lived in him. Tell me about him, Hakan said, surprising her. About your family before. Not how they died, but how they lived. So as they rode from trap to trap through the white silence, Liluya told stories she hadn't spoken aloud since the burning. She told Hakan about her father's laugh, deep and booming, how he would tell stories around the fire that made everyone in the village gather close. She described her mother's hands, always busy with some task, weaving or cooking or healing. Hands that had delivered half the babies in their settlement and set countless broken bones. She told him about Dakota's mischief, how he'd once released all the horses just to watch the chaos, how he'd courted disaster daily but always talked his way out of trouble with a smile and quick wit. She spoke of ceremonies and seasons, of the way her people had lived in balance with the land, until soldiers and settlers had decided that balance was inconvenient. Hakan listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a question that showed he understood Cherokee ways, that his mother had taught him well. And as Liluya spoke, she felt something loosening in her chest, some knot of grief that had been pulled so tight she'd forgotten it was there. They returned to the cabin as the sun began its descent, the temperature dropping rapidly as shadows lengthened across the snow. Inside, Hakon built up the fire while Lilui prepared a stew from the fox meat and some preserved vegetables she'd found in the cold room. The domesticity of it struck her suddenly. How easily they'd fallen into rhythms of shared living. How natural it felt to work alongside this man who'd bought her in a saloon 4 days ago. As they ate dinner in comfortable silence, Lilui realized she'd been in this cabin almost a week, and Hakon hadn't touched her once beyond helping her onto the horse. Hadn't made any demands, hadn't invoked any rights he might claim to have purchased. He treated her like a person, like an equal, like someone whose choices mattered. It was, she realized with a jolt of recognition, the first time in 3 months anyone had treated her like a human being instead of property. 2 weeks passed in the isolated valley, 2 weeks of routines that began to feel less like survival and more like living. The snow had settled into a thick blanket that would last until spring, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and deadly. Lilui found herself adapting to the rhythm of life at the cabin, rising before dawn to start the fire, working alongside Hakon through the short winter days, falling into exhausted sleep each night with fewer nightmares than the week before. But the fragile peace was shattered on a grey morning when Hakon returned, from checking the northern trapline with blood on his hands and fury in his eyes. "Riders came through during the night," he said, his voice tight and controlled. 3, maybe 4 men on horseback. They cut my traps, scattered the bait, left tracks leading straight toward the cabin. "They're not hunters, they're looking for something." Lilui felt ice form in her stomach. "Sloan? Maybe," Hakon agreed, already moving to check his weapons. "Or someone else who heard about the Cherokee woman I bought. Word travels fast in the territories, especially word about unusual transactions." He pulled his rifle down from the pegs and began cleaning it with quick, efficient movements. "We need to prepare for the possibility they come here. I need to know something, Lilui, and I need the truth. Can you shoot to kill?" Lilui met his eyes without hesitation. "I've killed 3 men already. A 4th won't trouble my conscience." Hakon nodded, accepting this. He moved to a locked chest in the corner and produced a second rifle, older but well-maintained, and a gun belt with a revolver that looked like it had seen considerable use. "These were my mother's. She was a better shot than my father, used to win shooting competitions at the trading posts. If men come for you, I want you armed." He showed her how to load and fire both weapons, how to aim for center mass rather than trying for difficult headshots, how to keep her breathing steady when fear made her hands shake. Lilui absorbed the information with the same focused intensity she'd brought to learning Obsidian's temperament, understanding that this knowledge might be all that stood between her and being dragged back to Sloane's custody. They spent the rest of that day fortifying the cabin. Hakon showed her how to bar the door from inside, where to position herself to have clear shots through the windows, how to reload quickly in poor light. He moved furniture to create barriers, positioned water buckets in case of fire, and packed emergency supplies in saddlebags that could be grabbed quickly if they needed to run. "If they come and things go badly," Hakon said as twilight fell, "you take Obsidian and ride north. Follow the creek bed for 5 miles, then turn west at the Twin Pines. There's a Cheyenne winter camp about 20 miles from there. Ask for a man named Two Hawks. Tell him Hakon Wolfridge sent you. He'll give you shelter and leave you to face them alone." Lilui demanded. "If it comes to that, yes," Hakon replied firmly. "You didn't survive 3 months of hell just to die defending my cabin. Maybe I'm tired of running," Lilui said, her voice sharp. "Maybe I'm tired of letting men decide what happens to me." Hakon studied her in the fading light, seeing the transformation that had occurred over 2 weeks. The hollow-eyed victim from the Bitter Creek saloon was gone, replaced by a woman who stood straight and met the world with clear eyes and steady hands. Whatever had been broken in her was mending, and what was emerging had edges sharp enough to cut. "Then we fight together," he said simply. "But we fight smart, not brave." That night they took turns keeping watch, 2 hours on and 2 hours off, the rhythm of soldiers' sleep that left both of them exhausted but alert. The cabin was dark except for the banked fire, every sound magnified by anticipation and fear. Liluyi sat by the window during her watch, her mother's rifle across her lap, and wondered when this cabin had started feeling like home rather than a prison. The attack came 3 days later, not at night as they'd expected, but in the pale light of a winter dawn when the world was caught between darkness and day. Liluyi was outside drawing water from the well when she heard the horses, 4 riders coming fast from the south, their breath steaming in the frozen air. She dropped the bucket and ran for the cabin, shouting a warning. Hakan was already moving, rifle in hand, his face set in hard lines. "Get inside. Bar the door after me." "Like hell," Liluyi snapped, grabbing her own rifle from where it leaned beside the door. The riders pulled up 20 yards from the cabin, spread out in a rough line. Liluyi recognized one of them immediately, the fat man from Bitter Creek who'd bid against Hakan, his face red with cold and meanness. The others were strangers, hard-eyed men who wore their violence like badges of honor. The fat man urged his horse forward a few steps. "Wolfridge, we're here for the Cherokee woman. Hand her over, and there won't be trouble. She's not property to be handed over," Hakan called back, his rifle held loose and ready. "You're trespassing. Turn around and ride out while you still can." "Can't do that," the fat man replied. "See, me and the boys here, we got to thinking about that auction. $300 for a woman, that's a lot of money. Maybe we were too hasty letting you walk out with her. Maybe we should have pooled our resources, made you a better offer. Or maybe," one of the other riders added with a cruel grin, "we just take what we want and save ourselves the silver." Hakan's rifle came up in one smooth motion. First man who reaches for a weapon dies. For a moment, everything hung in balance. 4 men against 2, but Hakan had superior position and the cabin at his back. The riders exchanged glances, calculating odds, trying to decide if the prize was worth the risk. Then Liluyi stepped out from behind Hakan, her rifle raised and aimed at the fat man's chest. "I killed the last 3 men who tried to take me," she called out, her voice carrying clear and cold across the frozen distance. "I'll kill you too, and I'll sleep just fine after." The fat man's eyes widened slightly. Something in her voice, in the absolute certainty with which she spoke, made him believe her. "Now you've heard the lady," Hakan said. "This is your last chance to ride away. Take it." One of the riders, younger and dumber than the others, made his choice. His hand dropped toward his gun, a movement born from bravado and poor judgment. 2 rifles cracked almost simultaneously, Hakan's shot taking the young man in the shoulder, Liluyi's catching him in the leg. He screamed and toppled from his horse, blood darkening the snow. "Next shots go center mass," Hakan warned, already working the bolt to chamber another round. "Your choice." The remaining 3 riders stared at their wounded companion, then at the 2 figures standing ready by the cabin. The fat man's calculation was visible on his face, weighing desire against survival. Finally, he spat into the snow. "This ain't over, Wolfridge. Word's gonna spread about this, about you harboring a runaway, about you shooting white men over a Cherokee woman. Territory's got laws about that kind of thing. Territory's got laws about human trafficking, too," Hakan replied coldly. "You want to talk to a marshal about laws? Let's do it. I'll be happy to explain how I found you trying to steal my property at gunpoint. The irony of using property law to defend Liluyi's freedom wasn't lost on anyone, but it was a weapon that worked." The fat man's face darkened with rage, but he jerked his head at the others. They collected their wounded companion, hauled him across a horse, and rode out heading south, looking back with promises of vengeance written in their eyes. Hakan and Liluyi held their positions until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Only then did Hakan lower his rifle, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. "You did good," he said quietly. "I meant what I said," Liluyi replied, her voice steady despite the fear that was now catching up to her. "I would have killed him." "I know," Hakan said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. They went inside together, barring the door and checking the windows. The cabin suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like what it actually was, a temporary shelter in hostile territory where violence was always just one bad decision away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "They'll come back," Lilui said, setting her rifle down with hands that finally started to shake. "Maybe not those 4, but others. That fat man was right, word will spread. Every bounty hunter and lawman between here and Fort Laramie is going to hear about the half-breed harboring a runaway Cherokee. Let them come," Hakan said with a certainty that surprised her. "This is my land, legally purchased and registered. You're here of your own free will that makes you protected under territorial law as my... He stopped, the word catching in his throat. "As your what?" Lilui pressed, stepping closer. "Your property. Your servant? Your redemption project?" "Be as my wife," Hakan said quietly, the words dropping into the space between them like stones into still water. Lilui froze, staring at him. "What?" "The territorial law recognizes common law marriage after cohabitation," Hakan explained, speaking quickly now like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "We've been living together for 2 weeks. That's enough to establish legal standing. If you're my wife, then you're protected by marriage law. No one can claim your runaway property. No one can challenge your right to be here." "You want to marry me," Lilui said flatly, trying to process this. "To protect me from the law by using the law, it would just be on paper," Hakan said quickly. "Just a legal fiction to give you protection. Nothing would have to change between us. You'd still have your space, your freedom. It would just mean that legally no one could touch you without going through me first." Lilui turned away, her mind racing. Marriage, even a legal fiction, felt like a trap. Every man who'd bought her had wanted to own her in one way or another, and marriage was just another form of ownership dressed up in prettier language. But even as she thought it, she knew Hakan was different. He'd had 2 weeks to force himself on her, 2 weeks to claim the rights he'd purchased in Bitter Creek, and he'd done nothing but treat her with respect and teach her to survive. "Why?" she asked, still facing away from him. "Why do you keep trying to save me? What do you get out of this?" "Well, maybe I'm not trying to save you," Hakan replied. "Maybe I'm just trying to stop failing the people who need help. Maybe I'm tired of being alone in this cabin with nothing but ghosts and regrets for company. Maybe having you here, teaching you, working beside you. Maybe that's the first time in 5 years I felt like I'm actually living instead of just surviving." Lilui turned back to face him, searching his eyes for the lie, for the manipulation, for the trap. But all she saw was a man as damaged and lonely as she was, reaching out across the void of their shared trauma to offer something that might be partnership instead of ownership. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "it's on my terms. This is a legal arrangement, nothing more. You don't get to demand anything from me that I'm not willing to give freely. I keep my weapons. I keep my freedom to leave if I choose. And if you ever try to force me into anything, I'll kill you in your sleep. Are we clear?" Crystal," Hakan replied without hesitation. "Then yes," Lilui said, the word feeling strange on her tongue. "I'll marry you on paper for protection. But nothing changes between us." "Nothing changes," Hakan agreed. But even as they spoke the words, both of them knew it was a lie. Everything had already changed, was changing still, shifting and settling into new patterns neither of them fully understood. The woman who'd sworn never to let another man touch her was agreeing to marriage, and the man who'd sworn never to care about anyone again was risking everything to protect someone who'd threatened to kill him in his sleep. The next morning, they rode together to the nearest territorial office, a rough building in a settlement 3 days south that served as courthouse, land office and marshal's station all in one. The clerk who processed their marriage license looked at them with obvious suspicion, seeing the Cherokee features in both their faces. But money was money, and the law was the law. He filed the paperwork, had them sign the register, and just like that, Lilui Rainwalker became Lilui Wolfridge. The ride back to the cabin was strange and tense. They'd crossed some invisible line, made their lie official in the eyes of the territory, and now had to figure out what that meant. Hakon was quiet, his usual stoic silence deeper somehow, while Liluye felt the weight of the new name like chains she'd voluntarily put on. But when they reached the valley and saw the cabin's smoke rising into the winter sky, something in Liluye's chest loosened slightly. This place that had started as a prison was slowly becoming something else, something that might eventually feel like home if she let it. That night, as they prepared dinner together in their usual companionable silence, Liluye spoke without looking at Hakon. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me a choice when everyone else just took. You don't have to thank me for basic decency," Hakon replied, but his voice was gentle. "In this world I do," Liluye said, finally meeting his eyes. "Because decent men are rarer than gold and twice as valuable." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither could name. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the recognition that love might be possible someday, if they were both brave enough to let it grow. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, carrying the promise of more snow and harder times ahead. But inside the cabin, two people who'd been broken by the world were slowly beginning to heal each other. One small act of kindness at a time. Spring came late to the Dakota Badlands that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the valley from frozen wasteland into something approaching paradise. The snow melted in rushing streams that filled the creek to overflowing, and green shoots pushed through the thawing earth with stubborn determination. Liluye watched the land wake from its winter sleep and felt something similar happening inside herself, some frozen part of her soul beginning to thaw. 3 months had passed since the marriage certificate was filed. 3 months of living as husband and wife in name, while maintaining careful boundaries in practice. Hakon still slept by the fire on his bedroll, still gave Liluye privacy and space, still treated her with a respect that felt increasingly insufficient for what was growing between them. They worked the land together, expanded the garden plot, repaired winter damage to the barn, and fell into rhythms so natural they sometimes forgot this had all started with a transaction in a filthy saloon. But the outside world hadn't forgotten. Twice more that winter, riders had come asking questions about the Cherokee woman, about the half-breed who'd killed a white man over her. Each time Hakon had produced the marriage certificate, shown them his land deed, explained in careful legal terms that his wife was protected by territorial law. Most backed off, unwilling to challenge documented legal marriage. But their eyes promised that documentation might not always be enough. Then came the morning when Liluye woke to find Hakon already gone, his rifle missing from its peg and a note on the table written in his careful hand. "Tracking poachers on the North Ridge back by sundown. Stay armed," it read. And beneath it, he'd drawn the Cherokee symbol for protection that his mother had taught him. Liluye spent the morning working the garden, turning soil that was finally soft enough to plant, setting seeds for vegetables that would sustain them through the next winter. The physical work felt good after months of being cooped up, and she found herself humming an old Cherokee song her mother used to sing while grinding corn. She hadn't hummed in 4 months, hadn't felt light enough in her chest to make music. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the horse approach until it was too late. When she looked up, a man was already dismounting near the cabin, and recognition hit her like a physical blow. Captain Marcus Hendricks, the man who'd burned her village and killed her family, stood 20 feet away wearing a cavalry uniform and a smile that made her blood turn to ice. "Well now," Hendricks said, his voice carrying that same casual cruelty she remembered from the worst day of her life. "Heard rumors about a Cherokee woman living out here with some half-breed trapper. Didn't expect it to be you, though. What was your name again?" "Lila?" "Liluye," she said, her voice steady despite the rage and terror warring in her chest. Her hand moved slowly toward the knife at her belt. "That's right, Liluye," Hendricks said, taking a step closer. "You were one of the pretty ones from that settlement we cleared last fall. I remember now, you watched your whole family burn. That takes a strong constitution. Most women would have lost their minds. What do you want? Liluya demanded, calculating distances and angles. Her rifle was in the cabin, too far to reach before Hendricks could draw his sidearm. What I want is to finish what we started, Hendricks replied, his hand resting on his gun belt. See, I've been hearing troublesome reports about you. Seems you've been spreading stories about that settlement clearing, claiming it was murder rather than legitimate military action against hostiles. That kind of talk is dangerous, makes the army look bad, makes me look bad. You murdered innocent people, Liluya said, her voice rising. You burned families alive, shot children, destroyed a peaceful village that had done nothing wrong. We followed orders, Hendricks interrupted, his smile fading. We cleared hostile territory of potential threats. That's what soldiers do. And now I'm here to make sure your version of events doesn't spread any further. Where's your husband? Close enough, Liluya lied, taking a step back toward the cabin. Don't lie to me, Hendricks snapped, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. I watched him ride north an hour ago, saw him tracking something into the high country. That's why I waited, wanted to have this conversation private-like. Now you're going to come with me quietly, and we're going to ride to Fort Laramie, where you'll recant every word you've said about the settlement clearing. You'll say it was a legitimate action, that your family were hostiles who fired first. And if you refuse, he cocked the hammer on his revolver. If you refuse, I'll put a bullet in you right here and tell anyone who asks that you attacked a military officer. Your half-breed husband can bury what's left. Time seemed to slow as Liluya's mind raced through options. She was unarmed except for the knife, too far from the cabin to reach cover, facing a man with a drawn gun who'd already proven he had no qualms about killing. Everything in her screamed to fight, to die on her feet rather than submit, but her hand moved to her belly in an unconscious protective gesture. She was 3 weeks late with her monthly bleeding, a fact she'd been trying not to think about, trying not to acknowledge what it might mean. If she was carrying Hakan's child, no, that was impossible, they'd never. But she'd been so tired lately, so nauseous in the mornings, and oh God, what if... Hendricks saw the gesture, saw her hand on her belly, and his smile returned. Well now, that's interesting. Does your husband know you're carrying, or is it even his? Cherokee women have a reputation for being friendly with whoever treats them decent. The insult cut through Liluya's paralysis, and rage flooded her veins like fire. Her hand moved to her knife, even as Hendricks raised his gun, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die, but she'd be damned if she died without fighting. The shot that rang out didn't come from Hendricks' gun. The captain staggered, blood blooming across his shoulder as his weapon fell from nerveless fingers. He spun toward the source of the shot, and Liluya followed his gaze to see Hakan standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle smoking, his face carved from stone and fury. You missed your shot, Wolfridge, Hendricks gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. That's going to cost you... I never miss, Hakan said coldly, working the bolt to chamber another round. That was a warning. Next one goes through your skull unless you're on your horse and riding in the next 10 seconds. Hendricks looked between Hakan and Liluya, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted against him. You're making a mistake, he said, backing toward his horse. Shooting a military officer is a hanging offense. You were trespassing on private property and threatening my wife, Hakan interrupted, his rifle never wavering. Territorial law gives me the right to defend my home with lethal force. Now you've got 5 seconds before I stop giving warnings. Hendricks hauled himself onto his horse, blood dripping from his shoulder, his face twisted with rage and pain. This isn't over, he snarled. I'll be back with soldiers, with warrants, with everything the law allows. You'll hang for this, and your Cherokee whore will watch before they take her back to where she belongs. Hakan's rifle tracked him as he rode out, finger on the trigger, and for a moment Liluya thought he might shoot despite the warning. But Hakan held his fire, watching until Hendricks disappeared over the ridge before finally lowering his weapon. Then he turned to Liluya, and the fury in his face transformed into concern. Are you hurt? Did he touch you? Liluya shook her head, unable to speak, trembling now that the danger had passed. Hakon crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other held her steady. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I left you alone. I'm sorry you came back," Lilui managed, her voice muffled against his shirt. "You came back in time." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the spring sunlight, and Lilui realized this was the first time Hakon had touched her, beyond helping her onto a horse or steadying her on rough ground. His arms around her felt safe in a way she'd forgotten existed, and she found herself pressing closer rather than pulling away. Finally, Hakon stepped back, his hands moving to her shoulders as he studied her face. What did he mean about what he said? "Are you—" "I don't know," Liluya interrupted, her hand moving to her belly again. "Maybe, I'm not certain. It might be nothing, but it might be something," Hakon said quietly, and something in his voice made her look up. His eyes held wonder and terror in equal measure, and she realized he wasn't afraid of the responsibility. He was afraid she'd think he'd somehow tricked her, somehow violated the boundaries they'd so carefully maintained. "And we never," she started, then stopped, confusion clouding her thoughts. "How could I be—" "The night of the first storm," Hakon said softly. "You don't remember you had a fever, were half out of your mind. I was trying to cool you down with snow, and you pulled me close, and memory crashed over Lilui like a wave. Fragments of that night she'd thought was a fever dream. Heat and cold and desperate human contact. Hakon's voice saying, 'Only if you're sure,' and her own voice, thick with delirium, saying, 'Please don't leave me alone.' And then, 'Oh God,' she whispered. "I should have told you after," Hakon said, his voice anguished. "Should have made sure you understood what happened. But you didn't remember the next morning, and I thought maybe it was better if you never knew. If we could just pretend it never happened. You let me believe we'd never," Liluya's voice trailed off. "I'm sorry," Hakon said, stepping back and letting his hands fall. "I know I should have told you. No, I should have been honest. If you want to leave, I'll understand. I'll give you obsidian, supplies, money, whatever you need to start somewhere else." Lilui stared at him, her mind churning through revelation after revelation. She should be angry, should feel violated, should want to run as far and fast as possible. But instead, she felt something else entirely, a strange sense of rightness, as if some part of her had known all along and was only now catching up to what her body had already accepted. "I'm not leaving," she heard herself say. Hakon's head came up, hope and confusion warring on his face. "You're not." "But I'm not," Liluya repeated, more certain now. "If I'm carrying your child, then it's already done. Running won't change it. And besides—" She stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "Besides, I think I stopped wanting to leave about 2 months ago. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. Liluya," Hakon breathed her name like a prayer. "I'm still angry you didn't tell me," she continued, her voice firm. "I'm angry you let me think I was safe from that when I wasn't. But I also understand why you stayed silent, and I believe you when you say it only happened because I asked. So I'm choosing to forgive you, and I'm choosing to stay, even knowing what's coming?" Hakon asked. "Hendricks will be back with soldiers. They'll arrest me for shooting an officer. They'll try to invalidate our marriage. They'll try to take you—" "Then we fight," Lilui said simply. "Together, like we fought those men in the winter. Except this time, we're not just fighting for survival, we're fighting for our child." The word hung in the air between them, transforming everything. Our child, not my child or your child, but ours. A future neither of them had dared to imagine becoming suddenly, terrifyingly real. Hakon pulled her close again, and this time Liluya wrapped her arms around him and held on tight, feeling his heart hammering against her chest, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. They stood like that, as the sun climbed higher, 2 damaged people clinging to each other, and the fragile hope that maybe, possibly, they could build something good from the wreckage of their pasts. That night they sat at the table making plans, their voices low and urgent. Hendricks would return, probably within a week, and when he did, he'd bring enough soldiers to overwhelm any defense Hakan could mount. The marriage certificate might not be enough to protect Liluye, not when a military captain was willing to lie and claim she was a hostile who'd attacked him. "We could run," Liluye suggested. "Pack what we can carry. Head west into the territories where the army has less reach. They'd track us," Hakan replied. "I'm good, but I'm not good enough to hide 2 people and a horse from trained military trackers. And running would look like an admission of guilt. Then we stand and fight," Liluye said, "against trained soldiers." Hakan shook his head. "That's suicide. Then what?" Liluye demanded. "We can't run, we can't fight. What's left?" Hakan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he spoke, his voice thoughtful. "We go political. We take our story to the territorial governor, document what Hendricks did at your settlement, get witness statements from other survivors if any exist. We make this bigger than just us, turn it into a scandal the army can't ignore. That would take weeks," Liluye protested. "Hendricks will be here long before." "Then we buy time," Hakan interrupted. "I ride to Fort Laramie tomorrow, file a formal complaint against Hendricks for trespassing and threatening my wife. Force him to defend himself through official channels before he can come back here with soldiers. Military bureaucracy might slow him down long enough for us to build a real case." It was a desperate plan, built on hope and legal technicalities, but it was better than no plan at all. They refined it through the night, anticipating objections, building arguments, preparing for every contingency they could imagine. As dawn approached, and exhaustion finally claimed them both, Hakan stood from the table and looked at his bedroll by the fire. Then he looked at Liluye, a question in his eyes he didn't voice. "Stay," she said quietly. Not like that, just, I don't want to be alone tonight." So they lay together in the bed for the first time, while both conscious and aware. Liluye's back pressed against Hakan's chest, his arm around her waist, his hand resting gently on her belly, where their child might be growing. Neither of them slept much, too aware of the warmth of another body, the rhythm of another's breathing, the strange new intimacy of chosen closeness. "Whatever happens," Hakan whispered into the darkness, "I want you to know I don't regret buying you that night. I don't regret any of this." "Neither do I," Liluye whispered back, and realized with surprise that it was true. Outside, the spring night was full of sounds, frogs singing in the creek, owls hunting in the darkness, the wind moving through new leaves. Inside the cabin, 2 people who'd been bought and sold, broken and rebuilt, alone and afraid, finally found something worth fighting for. The territorial governor's office in Cheyenne was a world away from the isolated cabin in the Badlands. All polished wood and leather-bound law books, and men in suits who'd never felt winter bite through inadequate shelter or gone to sleep hungry. Hakan sat in a hard-backed chair, his best clothes still marking him as frontier trash in this place of power, while 3 territorial officials reviewed the documents he'd brought: the marriage certificate, the land deed, the sworn statements he'd collected over 2 brutal weeks of riding. Liluye waited outside, not because Hakan had asked her to, but because they'd agreed it was tactical. Let the officials see the half-breed husband first. Let them hear his calm recitation of facts before confronting them with the Cherokee woman, whose existence challenged their comfortable narratives about settlement and civilization. The waiting room smelled of tobacco and old paper, and Liluye's hand rested on her belly, where the child was now undeniable. A small swell that had transformed from possibility to certainty. Inside the office, the lead official, a thin man named Patterson with wire spectacles and the careful diction of someone who'd learned to hide a working-class accent, finally spoke. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Wolfridge. You're accusing a decorated cavalry captain of murder, of falsifying military reports, of participating in the illegal sale of prisoners. Do you understand the consequences if you cannot prove these claims? And I understand that my wife watched her entire family murdered by soldiers under Captain Hendricks' command." Hakan replied, his voice steady. I understand that she was then sold to a flesh peddler for $50 by those same soldiers. I understand that Hendricks came to my property 3 weeks ago and threatened her life to prevent her testimony. Those are facts, not allegations. Patterson exchanged glances with his colleagues. Your wife is Cherokee. No offense intended, but Cherokee testimony against a white military officer. The territorial courts might not, which is why I brought corroborating evidence, Hakan interrupted, pulling more papers from his satchel. Statement from a missionary who documented the settlement 3 days before it burned, proving it was peaceful and posed no military threat. Statement from a territorial surveyor confirming the settlement was on Cherokee treaty land, not disputed territory. Statement from a quartermaster at Fort Laramie showing that Hendricks sold government supplies and pocketed the money, establishing a pattern of corruption. And this, he placed a final document on the desk, this one stained and worn. This is a letter from one of Hendricks' own soldiers, a private named Coleman, who deserted 2 months after the settlement burning. He couldn't live with what he'd witnessed, so he wrote everything down before he disappeared into the territories. He describes in detail how Hendricks ordered the fires set while families were still inside, how he personally executed prisoners, how he laughed while children burned. The silence in the office was heavy and uncomfortable. Patterson picked up the letter, read it slowly, his face growing pale. Finally, he set it down and removed his spectacles. Rubbing his eyes, "If this is authentic," he said carefully, "if even half of what's described here is true, then Captain Hendricks is guilty of crimes that would see him hanged. But you must understand, Mr. Wolfridge, that bringing charges against a military officer requires us to navigate both territorial and federal jurisdiction. The Army protects its own." "Then make them choose," Hakan said, leaning forward. "Make this public. Send copies of these documents to newspapers in Denver, Santa Fe, St. Louis. Let the public see what their army does to peaceful settlements in the name of clearing hostiles. Force the military to either investigate honestly or face public scandal. That's highly irregular," Patterson stammered. "So is burning families alive," Hakan replied coldly. "So is selling captive women. So is a captain threatening a civilian on her own property. You want to talk about irregular? Let's talk about how the United States Army has been conducting its operations in Cherokee territory." Another official, an older man with a grey beard and shrewd eyes, spoke for the first time. "You're playing a dangerous game, Wolfridge. Even if we investigate, even if we find Hendricks guilty, you've made an enemy of a man with military connections. He could make your life very difficult. He already tried to murder my wife," Hakan said flatly. "How much more difficult can it get?" The officials exchanged more glances, some silent conversation passing between them that Hakan couldn't read. Finally, Patterson spoke again. "We'll open an investigation. I can't promise it will go where you want it to go, military politics being what they are, but we'll examine the evidence. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you and your wife stay somewhere safe. If Hendricks learns about this investigation before we can take him into custody, he'll come for us," Hakan finished. "I know. We're prepared." They talked for another hour, going over details and timelines and legal procedures that made Hakan's head ache. But when he finally emerged from the office, he had what he'd come for, an official investigation. Documents stamped and filed, a paper trail that would be harder for the army to bury than a dead Cherokee woman and her half-breed husband. Liluya stood when she saw him, reading the answer in his face before he spoke. "They're investigating?" "They're investigating," Hakan confirmed, then pulled her close, not caring who saw or what they thought. "We bought ourselves time, maybe more, but we need to be smart about what comes next." They spent that night in a Cheyenne boarding house, a luxury after months of cabin life, though the thin walls and city sounds made sleep difficult. Liluya lay awake listening to Hakan's breathing, feeling the small life moving inside her, and wondered what kind of world this child would be born into. A world where justice was possible, or just another variation of the cruelty she'd already endured. The answer came 6 days later when they returned to the cabin to find it burned to the ground. The destruction was total and deliberate. The cabin was a blackened shell. The barn collapsed. Even the garden plot had been trampled and salted so nothing would grow. Obsidian was gone, either stolen or run off, and everything Hakan owned, everything his mother had left him, everything they'd built together was reduced to ash and memory. Liluye stood staring at the ruins, her hand pressed to her mouth, while Hakan walked through the wreckage with the careful steps of someone examining a grave. He found what was left of his mother's trunk, the dresses burned, the beadwork melted. He found the twisted metal of his rifle, rendered useless by heat. He found, and this made something break in his chest, the small wooden horse he'd been carving for the baby, now charred beyond recognition. "Hendricks," Liluye said, her voice hollow. "Probably," Hakan agreed, kicking at a burned timber. "Or men he paid. Doesn't matter who held the torch, the message is clear. He's telling us that legal complaints mean nothing, that paper and law can't protect us, that he can destroy everything we have, and there's nothing we can do about it." "So what do we do?" Liluye asked, exhaustion making her voice crack. Hakan was quiet for a long time, staring at the ruins of the only home he'd known for 5 years. Then he turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Not defeat, not despair, but a cold, focused rage that had finally found purpose. "We go to Fort Laramie," he said quietly. "We go where Hendricks feels safest, where he thinks he's untouchable, and we force a confrontation in front of witnesses he can't intimidate or kill. We make him face what he's done in public, where the army can't hide it." "That's insane," Liluye protested. "They'll arrest you the moment you step on military property. They'll take me back into custody. They'll have to admit why they're arresting us," Hakan interrupted. "Have to explain to every soldier and civilian present why a legally married couple seeking justice is being detained. We go in daylight, make sure there are witnesses, civilian traders, and frontier merchants who will spread the story, whether the army likes it or not. We turn this into theater, force them to play their hand where everyone can see." It was desperate and dangerous, and possibly suicidal, but Liluye found herself nodding. They'd tried running, tried hiding, tried working within the system, and all it had earned them was a burned home and a future that grew more precarious with each passing day. Maybe it was time to stop being victims and become something else entirely. They prepared for 3 days, camping in the ruins of their cabin, gathering what supplies they could scavenge or buy from distant neighbors who looked at them with pity and fear. Hakan traded his last valuable possession, his father's gold pocket watch, for a horse and saddle, not as fine as obsidian but serviceable. Liluye sewed her legal documents into the lining of her dress, insurance against confiscation. They practiced their story, refined their arguments, prepared for every objection the army might raise. The ride to Fort Laramie took 4 days through spring mud and uncertain weather. They traveled slowly, Hakan mindful of Liluye's condition, stopping frequently to rest and eat. Other travelers on the road gave them wide berth, seeing something in their faces that discouraged conversation. They were people on a mission, people who'd already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. As seen, Fort Laramie sprawled across the prairie like a small city, all wooden palisades and neat rows of barracks and the ordered chaos of military life. The main gate was guarded by 2 soldiers who straightened when they saw riders approaching, hands moving toward weapons before recognizing that the riders were just a man and a woman on a single horse. "State your business," one guard called out. "We're here to see the commanding officer," Hakan replied, his voice carrying clear and strong. "We have information regarding criminal activity by one of his captains." The guards exchanged glances, one of them disappearing into the guardhouse to consult with a superior. The other kept his hand on his rifle, watching them with the suspicious gaze of someone who'd learned not to trust unusual situations. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, an officer emerged from the guardhouse, a lieutenant with a crisp uniform and the kind of by-the-book precision that suggested he'd never bent a rule in his life. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison," he announced. You're making allegations against an officer? Against Captain Marcus Hendricks, Hakan confirmed, for murder, arson, illegal imprisonment, trafficking in human beings, and destruction of private property. We have documentation and witness testimony. Morrison's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition or concern. Those are serious charges. Do you have evidence to support them? Do we have everything necessary? Liluye spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her belly, including statements from military personnel who served under Captain Hendricks. Are you going to hear our complaint, or are you going to prove that the army protects criminals as long as they wear the right uniform? June, it was a calculated provocation, designed to force Morrison's hand in front of the growing crowd of soldiers and civilians who'd gathered to watch this unexpected drama. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he was smart enough to recognize a trap when he saw one. You'll be heard, he said formally, but you'll submit to a search before entering the fort, and you'll surrender any weapons. Standard procedure for civilian visitors. They agreed, had known they would have to, and allowed themselves to be searched and disarmed. Hakon's knife and Liluya's hidden blade were confiscated, but the documents sewn into her dress went undetected. Morrison escorted them personally through the fort, past drilling soldiers and working civilians, toward the commandant's headquarters at the center of the compound. They were halfway across the parade ground when a voice called out loud and mocking, "Well, well! If it isn't the Cherokee lover and his purchased wife." Captain Marcus Hendricks stood outside the officers' barracks, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his gun hand perfectly functional. He walked toward them with the confident swagger of a man on his own territory, surrounded by his own soldiers, absolutely certain of his invincibility. "Hendricks," Morrison said sharply, "stand down. These civilians are here under flag of truce to present a formal complaint." "Complaint?" Hendricks laughed, the sound ugly and cruel. "Is that what we're calling it when a half-breed murders a white man and his Cherokee whore lies about military operations to cover his crimes?" The crowd was growing larger now, soldiers and civilians drawn by the commotion. Hakon felt Liluya stiffen beside him, but kept his own expression carefully neutral. "We're here to present evidence of your crimes," Hakan said clearly, making sure his voice carried to every watching face. "Evidence that you murdered peaceful Cherokee families, sold prisoners for profit, falsified military reports, and burned my home to prevent testimony against you. You have no evidence," Hendricks snarled, his hand moving toward his weapon. "You have lies told by a savage woman and a breed who thinks he's white because he can sign his name. We have sworn statements from Private Coleman," Lily said, pulling the document from her dress with shaking hands. "Your own soldier, describing in detail how you ordered families burned alive. We have testimony from missionaries, from surveyors, from military quartermasters, documenting your corruption. We have everything we need to see you hang." Hendricks' face went pale, then red with rage. "That's Coleman deserted. His testimony is worthless." "Desertion doesn't make him a liar," Morrison interjected, his voice sharp. "Captain Hendricks, you will stand down and allow this matter to be adjudicated through proper channels." "Proper channels," Hendricks spat. "You're going to take the word of a Cherokee woman over a decorated officer? You're going to destroy my career based on lies and forgeries?" "I'm going to follow regulations," Morrison replied coldly, "which means hearing all evidence before rendering judgment. Now step aside." For a moment everything balanced on a knife's edge. Hendricks' hand was on his gun, murder in his eyes, and Liluya could see him calculating whether he could shoot them both and claim self-defense. But there were too many witnesses, too many civilians with no loyalty to military cover-ups, too many eyes watching. Hendricks stepped aside, but his voice carried clear and threatening. "This isn't over, Breed. You think you've won because you've got papers and statements. I'll destroy you in ways you can't imagine. Your wife will be back in chains before summer ends, and your bastard child will be raised by someone who understands its proper place." Hakan moved before thought, his fist connecting with Hendrik's jaw in a blow powered by months of controlled rage, finally finding release. Hendrik staggered back, blood spraying from his split lip, and went for his gun. Soldiers rushed forward from all directions, some grabbing Hakan, others restraining Hendrix. Morrison shouting orders that were lost in the chaos. Ditai didu sentiti zone. In the confusion, Liluye dropped to her knees and screamed, a sound of pure agony that cut through everything else. Hakan twisted in his captor's grip, saw her doubled over, saw the blood beginning to stain her dress, and felt the world narrow to a single desperate focus. She needs a doctor, he shouted, struggling against the hands holding him. Please! She's pregnant, she needs help. Morrison snapped orders, and two soldiers carefully lifted Liluye, carrying her toward the medical barracks while Hakan fought to follow. Behind them, Hendrix was being restrained, but his voice carried loud and victorious. See how your complaints end, breed. See how your schemes to destroy me only destroy yourself? The army takes care of its own, and you and your Cherokee whore will learn that before this is finished. But something in his words rang false now. Desperate rather than confident, because everyone had seen it, had witnessed a decorated captain threaten civilians, including a pregnant woman. The court of public opinion had already begun rendering its verdict in the murmurs and shocked faces of watching soldiers and civilians alike. In the medical barracks, a frontier doctor with steady hands examined Liluye, while Hakan paced the outer room under guard. Time stretched and contracted, minutes feeling like hours, the waiting more terrible than any physical pain. Finally, the doctor emerged, his expression grave but not hopeless. She's stable, he reported. The bleeding has stopped. The child seems unharmed, but she needs complete rest for at least a week. Any more stress or physical trauma could trigger a miscarriage. Can I see her? Hakan asked, his voice rough. The doctor nodded, and Hakan pushed past him into the small room where Liluye lay on a narrow cot, her face pale, but her eyes open and aware. He knelt beside her, taking her hand in both of his. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry I brought you here. Sorry I put you in danger. Sorry I— Stop, Liluye interrupted, squeezing his hand weakly. We did what we had to do. Did anyone hear? Did they see what Hendrix really is? They saw, Hakan confirmed. They all saw, and more than that, they heard him threaten you and the baby in front of dozens of witnesses. Morrison's face when Hendrix spoke about chains and proper places. Whatever sympathy the military might have had for one of their own died in that moment. Over the next 3 days, while Liluye recovered in the medical barracks and Hakan remained confined to quarters as a witness, the territorial investigation collided with military justice in ways that surprised everyone. Morrison, it turned out, was one of those rare officers who actually believed in the Army's stated ideals, and Hendrix's public threats had offended his sense of order and proper conduct. He pushed the investigation with bureaucratic ruthlessness, calling witnesses, examining evidence, building a case that even military politics couldn't easily dismiss. Private Coleman's letter proved devastating, corroborated by other soldiers who'd served under Hendrix and who'd been waiting for someone brave enough to speak first. The quartermaster's records showed a pattern of corruption stretching back years. The missionary's testimony established the settlement's peaceful nature. One by one, Hendrix's defenses crumbled under the weight of documentation and witness statements. On the 4th day, Liluye was strong enough to give her own testimony before a board of inquiry, speaking in clear, precise language about the murder of her family, her illegal sale, and Hendrix's threats. She held up her marriage certificate, her land documents, her citizenship papers, establishing beyond doubt that she was a legal resident with rights under territorial law. When she was finished, even the most skeptical officers looked uncomfortable. The verdict came down on the 7th day. Captain Marcus Hendrix was formally charged with multiple violations of military code, stripped of his rank, and remanded to territorial custody to face civilian charges of murder, trafficking, arson, and assault. He would hang, the board concluded, as soon as the territorial courts completed their proceedings. Hakan and Lilui watched from the commandant's office as Hendricks was led away in chains, the same chains he'd threatened to put on Lilui. The former captain's face was twisted with impotent rage, but he didn't speak, perhaps finally understanding that words could no longer save him. Morrison approached them as they prepared to leave, offering an envelope. "Compensation," he explained, "for the destruction of your property, paid from Captain Hendricks' seized assets. It's not enough. Nothing could be enough for what you've endured, but it's what the law allows." Hakan took the envelope, felt the weight of currency inside. "Thank you, Lieutenant, for doing what was right even when it was difficult." "It wasn't difficult," Morrison replied. "It was just right. I'm sorry it took this long. Sorry you had to fight so hard for something that should have been freely given. The army is supposed to protect all citizens, not just the ones we find convenient." They left Fort Laramie in late afternoon, riding slowly to accommodate Lilui's condition, the sun painting the prairie gold and amber as it sank toward the horizon. Behind them, the fort grew smaller, that chapter of their lives finally closing. Ahead lay uncertainty, the need to rebuild, to find a new place to call home, to bring a child into a world that remained harsh and unforgiving. But they rode together, Lilui's arms wrapped around Hakan's waist, his hand covering hers where they rested on the gentle swell of her belly. They'd survived everything the world had thrown at them, had turned trauma into strength and fear into courage, had found love in the least likely circumstances. "Where do we go now?" Liluia asked as the fort disappeared behind the rolling hills. "Wherever we want," Hakan replied, and in his voice was something she'd never heard before: hope. "We've got money to buy land, time to build something new, maybe somewhere greener, somewhere we can raise a child in peace." "Peace," Lilui repeated, tasting the word like it was foreign. "Do you think that's possible? For people like us?" "I think we've earned the right to try," Hakan said. "We've fought enough, survived enough, bled enough. Maybe now we get to just live." And as they rode into the golden afternoon, two people who'd been broken by cruelty and rebuilt by courage, they carried with them the hard-won knowledge that love could survive even in the harshest circumstances, that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply refusing to let the world's cruelty win. 6 months later, in a green valley 200 miles west, where the mountains met the plains, Liluye gave birth to a daughter with her father's dark eyes and her mother's fierce spirit. They named her Aita, after Hakan's mother, the woman who'd taught him that being half of two worlds didn't make you incomplete. And in the small cabin they'd built together, surrounded by land they'd purchased legally and claimed as their own, they raised their child to know both Cherokee traditions and frontier pragmatism, to understand both the language of her grandmother's people and the law that had finally, grudgingly, protected them. The story of the man who bought a Cherokee woman in a Bitter Creek saloon and ended up with a wife spread across the territories, growing and changing with each telling. Some versions made Hakan a hero, others cast Liluye as the true warrior of the tale. But those who knew them best understood that the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. They were just two people who'd refused to let the worst of humanity define them, who'd chosen to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate, to hope rather than despair, and in doing so had created something that would outlast the violence and cruelty of their age. Her family, a home, a future, and that in the end was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.